Okay, take two, and welcome to the quadruple D. So, in the early 2000s, Donald Trump publicly praised Jeffrey Epstein, saying in a 2002 interview, "I've known Jeff for 15 years, terrific guy. He's a lot of fun to be with. It is even said that he likes beautiful women as much as I do, and many of them are on the younger side." End quote. And you could read about that in the Washington Post, the Hollywood Reporter, and elsewhere. In 2003, Trump reportedly sent Epstein a birthday letter that included a drawing of a naked woman and the words, "We have certain things in common, Jeffrey," end quote. And you could find images of that. It's actually been released to the public, so feel free to check out that weird image if you want. And, it was a quirky thing to have revealed. And when Epstein was indicted for sex trafficking in 2019, Trump claimed he knew him like everybody in Palm Beach knew him, and that I was not a fan of his. So it's a little bit of a contradiction between saying he's a terrific guy and saying I was not a fan of his. It's a little bit of a mixed message there, Mister Orange Doofus. So, jump ahead. 4 months ago, Trump intervened to block the release of the Epstein files, the investigative records tied to Epstein's operations and associates. Then on Wednesday, that is November 12th, 2025, thousands of emails from Epstein's estate were published by the House Oversight Committee. These, these disclosed communications don't show a definitive smoking gun against Trump, at least if you ask some people, they don't, but they shed new light on his relationship with Epstein, including remarks by Epstein about Trump and his knowledge of the abuse network. So, again, some people say it's not a smoking gun. Others say, it's like a definitive smoking gun. It should be all the evidence you need. But as somebody who has served on a federal grand jury, I would say that this might not be the smoking gun that some people wish it was. So, but I am going to go through a timeline of the evidence of Trump being a creep, and there is certainly evidence. So, don't get me wrong here. He uh, he has said and done some things that have made him look like a total creep. And I'm going to go through a timeline of that, including creepy comments he's made about his own daughters. And it's going to be quite a journey. I'm also going to look at the I'm going to do like a little mini bio of Jeffrey Epstein himself, and also the way that the Trump administration has actually shielded Epstein from facing the worst legal consequences that he might have faced. Anyway, in one April 2011 email, Epstein wrote to Ghislaine Maxwell, or if you want to call her Ghislaine Maxwell. Anyway, Epstein said, "That dog that hasn't barked is Trump. Victim," and they said victim because the name has been redacted in the email. But anyway, victim spent hours at my house with him. He has never once been mentioned. So the likely meaning of that last part, where Epstein says he's never once been mentioned, Epstein appears to be commenting that despite one of his known victims spending hours with Trump, Trump's name had never come up in accusations or press reports about the trafficking or abuse network. The dog that hasn't barked phrase references The Hound of the Baskervilles by Arthur Conan Doyle, a metaphor for something suspicious because of its silence. So, yeah, it's a little bit odd, right? In other words, Epstein seems to be marveling or perhaps relieved that Trump, despite some contact with his operation, was not publicly implicated. It reads like a mix of surprise and calculation. Trump's been around, but nobody's called him out. you know? In another note, January 2019, Epstein wrote, Trump said he asked me to resign, never a member ever. Of course, he knew about the girls as he asked Ghislaine to stop. So the likely meaning there is that Epstein seems to be suggesting Trump was aware of the girls, that is, the underage ladies or young women associated with Epstein's sex trafficking ring. The phrase asked Ghislaine to stop could mean Trump allegedly told Maxwell to stop recruiting or bringing girls around him, either because he didn't want to be implicated or because he was uncomfortable or politically cautious about it, however you want to phrase it or look at it. So it's technically not a confession of participation. Rather, it's Epstein claiming Trump knew something was happening enough to request it stop around him. He's like it's like it's like if I don't know if you've ever watched Goodfellas, but at one point they do a massive heist, and Robert De Niro's character, or Robert De Niro, his character is asking these other people, to not wear fancy things and not buy fancy cars and stuff like that because it makes them look bad. It makes them look like they might have been guilty. It seems like the same premise here in a way, like I don't want to be around that. Get it away from me. Uh, it's maybe until the heat dies down, that sort of thing. So it really does remind me of the film Goodfellas in that respect. And it's also interesting, after the release of the emails, Trump reverted to his usual defense pattern, dismissing the matter as a Democrat hoax or distraction. The emails fuel public pressure, especially on the GOP led House, to force full disclosure of the investigation that Trump had previously been hiding, and very noticeably hiding. So White House lobbying has focused on four Republicans who signed a discharge petition to force a House vote on the Epstein files, technically probably distinct from those emails. The Epstein files and the emails are, you know, technically probably different. And the lobbying from Trump's White House included a direct appeal to Representative Lauren Boebert of Colorado, who was invited to the White House to be pressed on the matter. Although, shockingly, apparently it didn't work. So, as weird as this is to say, I think I actually have to give Lauren Boebert some credit. Um, it's a it's a very strange thing. But I suppose if somebody actually does the right thing, you got to give a little bit of credit where it's due. So, what this whole thing reveals is not just a single scandal, but a system. How elite power shields itself, how confidentiality is weaponized, how institutions, from the presidential office to congressional committees, collude to maintain opacity. Trump's handling of this episode mirrors his pattern. Confronted with leadership criticism, whether the affordability crisis, COVID, or the Russia probe, he labels them as hoaxes or con jobs, then fights so aggressively that the issue actually stays alive for longer, because he keeps bringing these things up. That's really, a sort of fatal flaw, because public memory is sort of infamously not very long. And he's actually one of the people keeping this stuff alive, and the MAGA movement, ironically enough. But there's more. Trump's behavior toward women and his own family, like I was referencing earlier, it suggests a culture of entitlement, objectification, and abuse of power. Multiple former contestants in pageants he once owned alleged that he walked into changing rooms unannounced while they were naked or half naked, many underage or otherwise vulnerable at the time. It's a place where you're going to be vulnerable in a changing room. And in a 2005 interview on the Howard Stern show, Trump said, "I'll go backstage before show. Everyone's getting dressed and ready. No men are anywhere, and I'm allowed to go in because I'm the owner of the pageant. I sort of get away with things like that." And, he said that he was inspecting the, the dressing rooms or maybe the contestants or something like that. Just and keep in mind this was at the Miss Teen USA thing, so they're known to be teenagers. So make of that what you want. On another front, in a February 2013 taping of the Wendy Williams show, Trump joked that what he and his daughter Ivanka Trump had in common was sex. That's right. She gave a sort of normal answer because Wendy asked what the two of them have in common, and Ivanka had said, business or some sort of generic and frankly non-controversial answer, and Trump said that he had sex in common with her. So basically, the emails deepen questions about Trump's past behavior, his ties to Epstein, and the broader elite network that enabled secrecy. The fight for the Epstein files is not only about disclosure, but about exposing the rules of elite exception. When those who hold power built the rules, made the exceptions, and guard the doors. So, all right, I'm going to go through the timeline that I was talking about earlier, starting with the late 1980s. So, Trump told New York Magazine that he had known Epstein for about 15 years. Remember that? And at this time, both men were socializing in Palm Beach and New York, with overlapping circles in business, real estate, and high society gatherings. And in 1992, a video archive shows Trump and Epstein together at Trump's Mar-a-Lago resort in Florida, pointing at women dancing in Epstein's presence. And now I do have to say that is technically not a crime in itself, right? You can be at a dance, you could remark at how attractive somebody is. Technically not a crime. Some people out there will be like, "Oh, it's creepy to do that," and whatever else. Now, but men do that, women do that. It's normal enough. But the point is, he was quite clearly in Epstein's orbit. Also in 1992, there was reporting of a calendar girl style party organized by a business partner involving 28 women intended for Trump and Epstein. So it was a party between the two of them and 28 women. And that was reported on by Time magazine, oddly enough. I normally don't think of Time or Newsweek as being the biggest heavy hitters when it comes to revealing interesting scandals, but they did that. They revealed that story. And in the mid 1990s, flight logs from Epstein's private plane show Trump, his then wife Maria, or Marla Maples, I almost said Maria, and daughter Tiffany flying in the mid 1990s. So they really knew each other, you know. Trump's company and Epstein had references in Epstein's Black Book of Influential Contacts, according to Time magazine again. In 2003, the birthday book compiled for Epstein's 50th birthday began circulating in later years. Among its pages was a sketch and note allegedly from Trump reading, "We have certain things in common, Jeffrey," and they they make some weird references to a weird word that describes young women, and that's been widely reported on, and on lists of allegations of sexual misconduct. Trump has a documented history of comments about young girls. In 1992, a clip shows Trump telling a child, "I'm going to be dating you in 10 years." So think about that one. You know, uh, so again, I don't think that's a crime into itself, but in the greater context here, it's a creepy comment for sure. You know, that's I'm trying to think of like times I've seen young girls, and I've never said that I'd be dating them in 10 years. You know, it's probably not a thought that would normally cross a person's mind unless they are having those types of thoughts. All right. In 2004, Trump reportedly purchased the oceanfront Palm Beach property, a Maison de l'Amitié, outbidding Epstein. So there were also, I guess, competing in terms of businesses as well, like acquiring property. And on the show, The Howard Stern Show, Trump made crude remarks about his daughter, Ivanka Trump, including agreeing with Stern that he could call her a piece of ass, end quote. Now, I believe I've actually, I believe I actually watched that episode when it aired, and I wasn't a normal Howard Stern show watcher, but I kind of remember being at my grandmother's house, and she had television where the Howard Stern show would air, and I kind of distinctly remember watching that episode for some reason. And so between 2005 and 2007, Trump's ownership of the Miss Universe slash Miss USA pageants on Howard Stern's show, he claimed that as owner, he could go backstage where contestants, often underage, were getting dressed, saying, "No men were anywhere, and I'm allowed to go in because I'm the owner of the pageant. I'm inspecting it." And allegations later emerged that Trump would walk into changing rooms where contestants were naked or half naked. So the contestants confirmed that, and you could read about that in at least one how or a one Rolling Stone article. I was going to say Howard Stern again, but yeah, you could watch the Howard Stern clip. See, I'm getting Rolling Stone and Howard Stern mixed up in my brain. Anyway, in 2008, Epstein was convicted in Florida on state charges of procuring a person under 18 for prostitution after a controversial plea deal. And I'm going to get more into that plea deal in a little bit here because that's interesting. That also further shows that, Trump had an interest in sort of protecting Epstein from consequences, at least for some time. Trump has said he was no longer friendly with Epstein well before this, stating that he hadn't spoken with him in 15 years, in other words, since 2004 at the time. And in the emails later released by the House Oversight Committee, Epstein wrote to his associate Ghislaine Maxwell, referring to Trump as that dog that hasn't barked, and said a victim spent hours at my house with him. And Trump's public persona increasingly includes comments objectifying women and his daughters, which has, of course, intensified criticism, and that's largely what I'm talking about here. But there's also the case against him that the Eugene Carroll case. So it's not just things that he said. It's actually gone into a courtroom or various courtrooms, perhaps, and there have been verdicts against him. Remember, in that Eugene Carroll case, he he said that well, he was asked about his quote about grabbing them by the pussy, and she asked, like, the person interviewing Trump asked, like, what his thoughts are about that. He said, "It's been that way for like a million years, fortunately or unfortunately, that you could do that sort of thing." I'm paraphrasing him, of course, but it's it's something like that. Why did you say fortunately or unfortunately? why would it be fortunate that you could just grab women like that? Like that's almost like an admission right there. So, when Trump launched his presidential campaign in 2015, his past associations and remarks became part of the scrutiny, but for whatever reason, they just didn't take hold. And really, that's also a political malpractice from the Democrats that they never really brought up his weird statements about his own daughter, like the Wendy Williams show thing, where he said that he had sex in common with Ivanka. Because keep in mind, that was not like the Howard Stern show, where he would perhaps provoke his guests in the same saying something controversial. In that particular clip, in that episode, Wendy Williams didn't say anything even remotely to egg on some perverted comments. That was just Donald Trump being Trump. So, the Access Hollywood tape and the Howard Stern recordings resurfaced and triggered some debate about Trump's campaign and his attitude toward women. But it's more than that. Epstein's network of abuse and trafficking became subject to renewed investigations and public scrutiny. And of course, the Epstein connections are apparently deep. Epstein was arrested on federal sex trafficking charges. He died allegedly by his own hands in a New York jail cell in August 2019 while awaiting trial. So you have to wonder, like, I mean, the meme is that he didn't do that to himself, right? And at the time, Trump said, I knew him like everybody in Palm Beach knew him. I was not a fan of his. Yet he had all these wonderful things to say about him previously. And Trump said he ended his friendship with Epstein because, quote, he stole people that worked for me, end quote, and claimed to have banned him from his Florida club for that reason. So not because of the crimes, but because he stole people that worked for him. That's, a little bit strange. So it's almost like it doesn't even occur to him really that the alleged behavior or the proven criminal behavior was the main factor. It's that he stole people that worked for him, and you have to wonder what exactly that means. What does he mean by working for him? You know, uh, so in the birthday book for Epstein's 50th birthday, you have that sketch. Uh, it was released publicly by the House Oversight Committee, and the Trump has maintained that the note is fake. Even though he's even said that he's never drawn women before, and that he doesn't draw things well. That's not true. He, he used to actually draw things for a charity organization. That there's been an article or two about the fact that he actually has drawn things and that it's a matter of public knowledge. And ABC News has an article titled that it's called Epstein offered reporter photos of Donald and girls in bikinis in my kitchen. And a few days after Trump's first inauguration on February 8th, 2017, Epstein, in conversation with Larry Summers, who was the Treasury Secretary under President Bill Clinton, said, recall I've told you I have met some very bad people, none as bad as Trump. No one decent, or not one decent cell in his body. So yes, dangerous, end quote. So Epstein admitted to Larry Summers that he's met bad people, but none as bad as Trump, who doesn't have a decent cell in his body. And for that reason, Epstein maintained that Trump was dangerous. And in a December 3rd, 2018 exchange, someone whose name is redacted wrote to Epstein, "It will all blow over. They're really just trying to take down Trump and doing whatever they can to do that," end quote. And yes, thanks, Epstein responded. "It's wild because I am the one able to take him down." It's worded kind of weird. I mean, Epstein was he worded things a little strangely apparently, and he has eyes in a lowercase and plenty of misspellings and stuff like that. But anyway, Epstein obviously right there is saying that he was the one who could have taken him down. So if you're wondering why maybe he was taken out in that jail cell, well, you might have a potential answer right there. So interestingly, yes, the recent batch of emails from Jeffrey Epstein does include claims that Bill Clinton had never visited Epstein's infamous island, the Little St. James Island in the Virgin Islands. So that was a bit of a surprise, too. I always thought that maybe Bill Clinton had been to the island and that he was, just as guilty as the Republicans were claiming. So, does this mean the Democratic Party should stop distancing itself from the Clintons? No, I would say they should keep a distance from these types of people. If nothing else, they're obviously corporate Democrats, so that should be reason enough. When it comes to that sort of thing. However, the Epstein allegations apparently might not be as real about Clinton as the GOP made them out to be, or as real as I thought they could be. So that was one of the weird revelations from these emails. At least potentially, you could say that they clear Bill Clinton. All right, so on to the second segment. So this is called the Peripheral Poophead of the Week, and it is none other than Jeffrey Epstein. Born on January 20th, 1953, in Brooklyn, New York, Jeffrey Edward Epstein spent his early years in New York City after beginning his career in education, teaching at the Dalton School despite lacking a university degree. He was dismissed in 1976 for whatever reason. I don't know what happened there, but it probably wasn't anything good. And he entered the banking and finance world, working at Bear Stearns and eventually founding his own firm. Through that, he cultivated a wealthy elite social network, acquiring multiple residential properties, including in Manhattan and a private island, and moving in circles of high power. While he publicly thrived in finance, Epstein maintained a covert criminal operation, recruiting and exploiting underage girls and young women. His abuse took place over many years, with victims as young as 14. In 2005, local law enforcement in Palm Beach, that's Florida, of course, began investigating after a parent reported that Epstein had abused her 14-year-old daughter, and federal authorities later identified dozens of victims. In 2008, Epstein pleaded guilty in Florida to state charges of procuring a child for prostitution and soliciting a prostitute following a controversial non prosecution agreement with the U.S. Department of Justice under U.S. Attorney Alex Acosta. So I'm going to get more into him later and why that was so controversial, and actually how that sort of feeds radical critiques of power. So the agreement shielded him from federal child trafficking charges, which critics say reflects how the state protects the wealthy and well connected rather than victims. Epstein served about 13 months in custody, much of it with work release, and the case highlights systemic dysfunction in many ways. Wealth and influence enable a man to exploit vulnerable minors, while institutions that claim to protect them repeatedly failed. A timeline from 1996 to 2025 charts the institutional breakdown. Reports of abuse were ignored, federal investigations delayed, and the prosecutorial decision making disproportionately served Epstein's class and networks. Epstein was arrested again on July 6th, 2019, facing federal charges of sex trafficking of minors in Florida and New York. He pleaded not guilty and was denied bail. While awaiting trial at the Metropolitan Correctional Center in Manhattan, he was found dead in his cell on August 10th, 2019. The New York City medical examiner ruled his death self inflicted by hanging. So, a very controversial thing that happened, of course. From a radical critique of power and elite connections, there remain profound questions about his death. Two guards were charged with falsifying records. Two cameras inside his cell malfunctioned. His cellmate had been removed, and the video footage released appears to have missing or edited segments. And these irregularities have spawned widespread public skepticism of the official narrative and stimulated conspiracy theories about murder, negligence, or elite cover ups. So, this is one of those instances where the conspiracy theories, as they're called, could easily actually be true. In 2025, the DOJ and the Federal Bureau of Investigation published a memo stating that no client list of co conspirators was found, that Epstein died by his own hands, and that no uncharged third parties would be pursued. And at the same time, documents newly released shows private bank accounts with major institutions such as Goldman Sachs and HSBC, and the failure of those banks and the state to stop his abuses. So, the story illustrates how power, wealth, and state institutions intertwine to reproduce abuse. Epstein's elite networks granted him impunity for years. Law enforcement's failures reflect how the state protects property and privilege rather than vulnerable humans. The non prosecution deal shows how justice is negotiable when money and connections are involved. And, you know, it's like the mechanisms of incarceration, oversight, and transparency end up serving the powerful sometimes. So yeah, that's a significant thing, right? And when it comes to Alexander Acosta, he's the fetid fever dream flashback of the week. This is the biggest scandal involving Alexander Acosta, the former U.S. Secretary of Labor and ex-U.S. Secretary or ex-U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of Florida. His role in negotiating that non-prosecution agreement in 2008. It's a controversial thing. While serving as U.S. Attorney, Acosta approved a secret deal that let Epstein avoid federal charges of sex trafficking, gave immunity to potential co conspirators, required Epstein to serve only 13 months in a private wing of a county jail, during which he was allowed to leave for work up to 12 hours a day, 6 days a week. This deal was concealed from Epstein's victims, violating the Crime Victims' Rights Act. So, pretty controversial. And when Acosta was nominated as Secretary of Labor in 2017, the deal resurfaced. The Miami Herald's 2018 investigation exposed its scope and secrecy, which caused it ignited national outrage. Under pressure, Acosta resigned in 2019. So, yeah, you've got some controversial stuff involved here. So, if you want to be comprehensive about your analysis, I think you might focus less on individual corruption and more on how hierarchies of power, privilege, and state protection function as a system. This is partly about class and power immunity. Epstein's wealth and elite connections granted him near total impunity. Acosta's office, part of the state's supposed justice apparatus, protected a capitalist elite from accountability to a large degree. And from a radical, or you might even say accurate lens, this isn't a failure of the system, it's how the system works as designed. The law serves the ruling class. You know, Epstein was a wealthy person and he operated in circles of other wealthy people. So there was a bit of an illusion of justice here. You know, uh, the scandal shows how justice is applied asymmetrically. In contrast to him just getting a slap on the wrist, poor people, especially from marginalized backgrounds, face more brutal punishment. Elites like Epstein can buy leniency. So, those goofball, silly Billy anarchist types would argue that this reveals the law as a tool of domination and not morality. You might still punish somebody, especially if it's politically convenient, to show that, hey, the system actually works. But in a lot of cases, the punishment will just be a slap on the wrist. And you've got some state secrecy and institutional self preservation, the concealment of the deal, and disregard for victims' rights. It shows how state institutions prioritize protecting themselves and their allies over transparency or ethics. Bureaucracies close uh, to the elites, they will choose to preserve authority even at the expense of truth. And of course, if you want to get into a little bit more of a feminist type thing, you might talk about gender power and control here. Epstein's crimes and the state's complicity, they might be said to embody patriarchal violence and all that fun stuff.